Ecosystems provide ecosystem services that we can categorise into production services, so those related to crops or producing habitat or fertile soil. Regulation services, so we're talking about clean water and clean climates. And also cultural services, so that's your education and your recreational benefit. And so all of these services flow from ecosystems and they underpin the value that we get. And it can either be direct use value, so that's a value we get from directly using ecosystems, or indirect value, so the indirect value we get from ecosystems, or option values are the values we get from the option to use ecosystems in the future. And then also non-use values, so the value we get not from using these ecosystems, but from knowing that they exist or knowing that we can pass them on to our grandkids. And obviously it's not just from ecosystems that all of this value flows. People interact with ecosystems, we use the technology, we know we've got these ideas in our heads about what we want. But the point here is that natural assets and the ecosystem services that flow from them are critical in underpinning productive capacity and human well-being. And that's the first main point that I'd like to make. And we care about ecosystem services because they underpin the basics of survival through to the requirements for a good life. We care about ecosystem services because studies have estimated that their contribution could be in the range of US $16 to $54 trillion per year. And we care about ecosystem services because just as with any other form of asset, unless we understand the role that they play in productive activity and unless we account for them, it's likely that we might undervalue them, overuse them, not know when we might be approaching a position of no return or return at great cost. But the challenge is that ecosystem services are often really difficult to see. They're really difficult to measure and they're really difficult to account for by governments, private landholders and in markets. And so this is one of the great challenges, and this is also where economic valuation can play a really useful role. So when we talk about value as a basis for decision making, what we're talking about is that generally in making decisions about a new policy or a new development, we're looking at the relative value of the alternatives. We weigh out the pros and cons, we look at the costs and benefits. And economists are often called to play a role in this kind of activity. Even if the decision is going to be primarily political, there's going to be some kind of assessment, we would hope. But the question is, what are we talking about when we ask about value? And economists will have a different answer to it, an ecologist and a sociologist, and I think all of these different answers are equally important. The way in which an economist is going to approach the question of value is by asking how a development or a policy affects someone's welfare. And so that is based on an economic theory of value that says that an individual is probably the best place to judge whether something has value to them and to judge whether something is going to impact a gain in their welfare or a loss in their welfare. And one way in which economics approaches this question is to say, all right, well, let the individual decide if they're going to experience a gain in their welfare. Let's see how much, by asking how much they might be willing to pay for that gain in their welfare. Similarly, if they were to experience a loss in their welfare, we might ask how much might they be willing to accept in compensation. And so that's how we go from the notion of a change in welfare to the idea of an economic dollar value. It's a very, very simplified history, explanation, but sometimes the leap from a benefit, a welfare benefit, to a dollar value is a little bit difficult, but that's the basic story. And so for some of the aspects or impacts of a development, there's going to be a market. It's going to be relatively easy to assess a change in welfare because we can see it in a marketplace. So for example, many of the direct use values, so the box to the left, will have a market. So things like water or timber or fish, and we can look at the market and we can assess how people's welfare is going to be impacted. But many of the impacts, essentially on ecosystem services, might not have an impact. And so they are called non-market values, and so we often look to other methods to assess their economic value and the impact on people's welfare. And so this is one way that we can ensure that ecosystem services are incorporated into the decisions about a new policy or development, for example, through economic valuation that seeks to estimate the dollar value associated with a gain or loss in people's welfare. And this is useful because it means that impacts on non-market goods and services can be incorporated into decision making in the same way that other impacts are, the market impacts are. And so that's my second point, is about the role that economic valuation can play. And so I want to take you through an example using my current work that might make it come alive a little bit more. So the current work that I'm doing is a project with the Tropical Rivers and Coastal Knowledge Research Hub. And so this was established as a research hub under the Commonwealth Environmental Research Facilities Program in 2007. And we know that there's an increasing interest and awareness in the value of water around Australia. 70% of Australia's fresh water lies in Northern Australia, and there have been some really exciting ideas about what to do and how to develop this water resource. But there are very significant gaps in our knowledge at the moment, significant gaps in how do these water resources work, what's the connection between the water under the ground and the water on the surface in the streams and main channels, and also what do people in the north want with that water, what are their aspirations, and where are the imperatives for development coming from, whose visions are they? And so TRAC is this research hub. It's a coordinated research effort that's bringing together social scientists, economists and environmental scientists to solve some of these issues, to start learning a little bit more about some of these issues. TRAC receives major funding through the Australian Government's Commonwealth Environmental Research Facilities Initiative, the Australian Government's Raising National Water Standards Program, Land and Water Australia, and the Queensland Government's Smart State Innovation Fund. And so the project that I'm involved with is looking at the economic value of Australia's tropical river ecosystem services. And it's also funded by the Maya Foundation. And so we started in mid-2006, and we decided to work on 3 rivers across Northern Australia. So the Daly River in the Northern Territory, the Fitzroy River in Western Australia, and also the Mitchell River in Queensland. And so we decided that we would like to provide a little bit more information about the value of some of the non-market benefits of these river systems. So some of those things that I showed you through the photos at the beginning of this presentation. And so there are many different methods that we could use to do this. We could ask a question like, if we had to recreate some of those ecosystem services using human-made technology, how much might that cost us? So that's the idea of, it's a cost of production. How much would we have to pay to produce that if it weren't working or we weren't getting the services we wanted? So that's one method. Another method is called revealed preferences, where you can ask people questions about their behaviour with regards to another thing, and that reveals their preferences about an ecosystem service. For example, the hedonic pricing method you can use to assess the dollar value of a view of a river system, for example, or a view over a natural wetland. And you can estimate it by looking at the difference in the price of houses. So what's the price of a house that has that view versus what's the price of a house that doesn't have that view? And another method is called the stated preference approach, where you generally use a questionnaire to ask people more direct questions about how much they would be willing to pay to protect the habitat of a certain aquatic species, for